The Monster of Loch Ness. In the days when monsters roamed the earth, they kept mainly to the high mountains, the deep waters, or the far islands. The monsters were big and scary looking, and knew that when they wandered near the homes of human folk, they caused terror and alarm. Humans usually shrieked and ran into their houses when they saw a monster, but from time to time they armed themselves with swords and sticks and stones to chase one. If they caught it, they would keep it in a cage, or sometimes even kill it. So the monsters learned to stay in remote places and went about their business unobtrusively, sometimes living right under the noses of humans without ever being noticed. Nowadays, monsters still keep themselves well hidden, but if you search carefully, you will find out where they are. If you mull over a map of Scotland, you will see their outlines on the islands. And if you scan the Scottish mountains, you will see their shapes where they lie sleeping. And if you watch the deep, dark waters of Loch Ness for a long time, you will see the monster who dwells there. In olden times, the people who lived by the shores of Loch Ness were farm folk, fisher folk, and fairy folk. On the green land surrounding the loch, the farm folk tended their cattle and crops. In the waters of the loch, the fisher folk spread their nets and caught fish. Up and down and across the loch from side to side, between the hamlets and the harbours, the ferry folk plied their boats to carry passengers and goods and livestock. Among these ferry folk was a boy named Mackenzie. Mackenzie's father had been a ferryman, and so had his father before him, and his father before him, and so on, as far back as anyone could remember. His ferry boat journeyed from the furthest southwestern point of the loch at the entrance to the Great Glen, downstream to the furthest northeastern point at the port of Inverness. Mackenzie was very familiar with the waters of Loch Ness. He knew the safest route to avoid the patches of weed and reeds that might tangle on the rudder of his boat. With his hand on the tiller, he was very adept at steering his way through the swirls and eddies of the loch, in good weather or in bad. In good weather, the loch was beautiful to behold and peaceful to sail upon. In bad weather, the loch could be extremely dangerous, for there is more water in Loch Ness than every other loch and lake in England and Wales together. An unexpected flurry of wind could make the waves choppy and rock the ferry boat violently. One winter, the worst for many years, crops failed, cattle died, and in the loch the fishing was poor. Each home suffered for lack of food. On a bleak midday, Mackenzie had moored his boat and was preparing to eat his dinner of 2 small fish and a handful of oatmeal, when he sensed that he was being watched. He looked up. A grey head bobbled in the water nearby. 2 eyes gazed at his fish. It was too large to be an otter, but it was strange for a seal to be so far inland. Mackenzie thought that perhaps starvation had driven the animal here. It certainly seemed hungry. He glanced at his 2 fish. This was a meagre meal for him, but he did have the oatmeal too. So he lifted the 2 fish and threw them over the side of his boat. The creature opened its mouth to catch them. Only as its head came out of the water did Mackenzie realize the extent of its neck. He leapt to his feet and stared in disbelief. This was no seal, This was something he had never seen before. The animal's neck was the length of his boat, and where it joined the body there was an enormous hump, and after that an even longer tail. Mackenzie gaped as the monster towered above him. A single flick of its tail could smash his boat to pieces. But the monster dipped its head, as if saying, "Thank you." Making wide ripples, it dived under the surface of the loch, and the waters became quiet again. Mackenzie resolved not to mention that monster to anyone. Folk did gossip about seeing monsters, but few believed these stories. If he told of what he had seen, people might laugh at him. Or, if they thought his tale was true, they might hunt the monster, out of fear or for food. They definitely would not be happy with what he was doing, which was dropping some fish into the water whenever he passed that spot in the loch. Later that same winter, Mackenzie was on his route to Inverness one evening when a storm blew up. The wind strengthened and hail beat in his face. He had no passengers on board, and he was glad of that, for the boat was heaving as the heavy current dragged it along. Using all his strength, Mackenzie grasped the tiller to guide his boat. If he didn't deliver his cargo of barrels and boxes to Inverness, he would not get paid. But the waves grew stronger and pounded against the hull as he tried to hold his boat on a steady course. Then a freakish gust struck. The boat spun out of control, and with a horrible grinding, tearing noise, the rudder broke off. Now there was no means of steering. Mackenzie was at the mercy of the wind and the waves. His boat was pulled this way and that by the force of the storm. The boxes and barrels began to roll and slide around. Mackenzie grabbed a box and hauled it back into the centre of the deck, but it was no good. As soon as he put one box in place, another slipped loose. Water was swilling into the boat. Within minutes it would be swamped. The boat would tip over, and Mackenzie would end up in the freezing cold waters of the loch. Suddenly, there was a hard dunt at the stern, and the whole boat shuddered. "Oh no," Mackenzie cried. "I have hit a rock." He peered over the side. A round grey lump was sticking out of the water. Mackenzie groaned. If the rock had torn a hole below his waterline, his boat would sink in seconds. In the gloom, he saw the grey lump rise up from the waves, and two eyes looked into his. It was not a rock. It was the monster. Mackenzie's heart leapt in his chest. A few fish every day was not enough to feed a beast of that size. Had the monster seen he was in trouble and come to eat him? The monster lowered its head and butted the boat once more. And then Mackenzie understood. The monster was pushing his boat to propel it forward through the stormy waters of the loch. It was almost daylight when Mackenzie reached Inverness. The banks of the loch were crowded with people, for the fairy folk are like family, and they had come to search for him. Their lanterns shone out in the darkness, and they carried poles with long hooks at the end to grapple the boat and draw it safely to the pier. As they did so, the monster raised its head from the water. Mackenzie waved his thanks as it swam away. But from the shore came screams and shouts. "It's a wild beast! It has come to attack us! It will eat our children! Kill the monster! Kill the monster!" Quickly Mackenzie tied up his boat, Men and women were running hither and thither, calling to each other, "Bring swords, bring sticks, bring stones. We must arm ourselves and hunt the monster down." "No," Mackenzie tried to calm them. "The monster is a kindly beast." "There is no such thing as a kindly monster," they told him. "We must kill it before it harms us." "But this monster means no harm," Mackenzie pleaded. But nothing he said could change their minds. "The monster was chasing you," they told him. "The monster was helping me," Mackenzie replied. "But the monster will eat our children," they told him. "The monster eats only fish," Mackenzie replied. "How do you know this?" one man said suspiciously. "Are you a friend of this monster?" Mackenzie saw that he could say nothing more, or they would turn their fear and anger on him, and he too would be in danger. At that time, a holy man by the name of Columba was travelling near Loch Ness. He had come from the island of Iona and was well respected, for he brought learning to the people and his teachings were wise. Mackenzie decided to ask him for help. Columba of Iona listened to Mackenzie's story. He went to the water's edge where the people had gathered to begin their hunt for the monster. A hazel tree was growing there, and from it he cut wood to make himself a long staff. Then Columba stretched out his arm so that the hazel staff lay over the waters of Loch Ness, and he said aloud, "O monster of the Loch, I bid you to appear before me." All present looked at the loch, but the waters remained unruffled. So Columba cried out in a louder voice, "O monster of the Loch, I bid you to appear before me." Again, all present looked at the loch, but the waters remained unruffled. And then Columba cried in his loudest voice, "O monster of the Loch, I bid you to appear before me." There was silence. No one spoke or moved. And then the surface of Loch Ness stirred. The water surged apart, and the monster reared up. First its head, then its neck, then its body, and then its tail. When the people saw how huge it was, they fell to their knees trembling. "Save us from the monster," they begged Columba. "Save us from the monster." Columba pointed his staff at the monster and said, "I bid you be at peace with the air above. I bid you be at peace with the earth below. I bid you be at peace forever in the waters of the deep." The monster fixed its eyes on Mackenzie. Mackenzie nodded. Whereupon the monster bent its head and slid quietly under the water. Columba declared that, although from time to time people might catch a glimpse of the monster, it would never seek to destroy them. Now and forever the monster of Loch Ness would be content to remain in the deepest, darkest waters of the loch. The people thanked Columba for saving them from the monster. But after they had drifted off to their homes, Columba smiled and said to Mackenzie, "I believe that, in this case, it is the monster who has saved the people."